Alright, so hello and welcome. Today we're going to be reacting to How to Raise a Medieval Army documentary by Invicta. I'll leave their stuff in below, and as long as my Patreon and all that stuff. But we're going to be reacting to this, and my speciality, or at least the new history that I'm trying to learn a lot more about, is medieval. So I do quite know a lot of it about this subject. Interesting to what they're going to have to say. As always, leave a like, go to support the actual creator. Otherwise, let's get to it.
Pop cultural depictions of medieval or pseudo-medieval armies are extremely common in today's media. These armies are often either shown marching dramatically to the battlefield or are already deployed on it. In reality, though, these sorts of armies didn't just materialize out of thin air. A small portion of media seem to understand this and provide at least a token explanation by having some general say the magic words that will do the trick.
Usually, like raise the levies or call the banners is something that Game of Thrones has said.
Call the banners. Summon the Elector Counts. Muster the Rohirrim. But this is usually just a plot convenience that ignores much of the realities of ancient warfare. In this video, we will discuss what it really took to raise a medieval army.
Yeah, so they just kind of use those lines as throwaway lines, like raise the banners, and then it cuts to everybody mobilized. No, takes a long time. Before, the internet, fun fact, you had to get a fucking letter in the mail. And some of these systems had such a system. But in reality, it was just, it would get to the Lord's got to raise everyone around him. It's very slow.
Before we begin, it must be stated that even our own in-depth video here will be filled with its own generalities and summarizations. This is a consequence of the fact that the medieval period in the popular imagination covers hundreds of years of history and an incredibly large geographical area.
Yeah, it depends where you start. Um, I've seen as far as 1444 being the end date, you could push it even further to 1492 when Columbus did his thing. You could start as early as 600. You could start as early as 300. It depends. Where do you want to start? Usually the start point is Charlemagne, and the end point is usually the fall of Constantinople. Generally, is what we would classify the medieval term as. But again, there's a whole bunch of play you can do there.
An army raised in the Eastern Roman Empire in the 8th century would look and function very differently to a 15th century French royal army.
It is very true. The Byzantines at this time, pretty much until like the 15th century, 15th, 16th century, were the only ones with an actual professional standing army. That wasn't, of course, in the Muslim world. They had their own thing. But Byzantines had an actual professional standing army with the Varangian guards and all the other stuff. They were one of the very few people that actually had a standing army. Everyone else in Europe, basically, was on the feudal system, which was semi-professional troops. Knights are basically professional troops, but they do a lot more functions. They're more like samurai than they are actual like professional soldiers. You start seeing that progression into professional soldiers in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. Before then, it's a little murky. But what they do have is mercenaries. Mercenaries were a very big thing in Western Europe because those were actual soldiers that were paid. Not by this, usually by a king, not by the state. So their loyalty would be to whoever king or whoever paid them. They were especially prevalent in Italy.
Therefore, this video is not intended to provide a complete understanding of how all medieval armies were raised and organized, but rather to provide a simplified look at the dynamics and structural factors behind the assembly of a typical medieval army of Western Europe, which is the basis of most media depictions. So what is a typical medieval army? Well, we can start to get a sense of things by looking at larger macro trends in military history. In the preceding era, Europe had witnessed a gradual consolidation of power under the Romans, who eventually developed standing professional forces.
Yeah, and that was um, under Marius is the best way I would describe it. Is under him, um, started to really become professionalized, and then of course in the imperial times they really were professionalized by then. But then again, we're talking small numbers here. For this massive territory, you have to think that these legions actually weren't that big. Had like 200 something thousand, nowhere near like the millions we would think to control this territory.
These legions were numerous, well-equipped, and well-trained, as a result of the vast pool of resources that could be leveraged to sustain them. But as the Roman Empire fell into decline, power once again began to fracture and revert to the local level. This meant that military forces reverted from large bodies of professional standing troops to smaller groups of warriors organized around an individual aristocrat's household or by local communities pooling their more limited resources to provide for their own defense.
This is a very key fact too, because Rome had again, if you just think about it, just how big your empire is, you can start to specialize. Even then, specialize different regions to make hey, your region is going to make armor. This one's going to make swords and stuff. When you break apart the empire and you're having to go back to basically aristocratic systems, which is what barbarians used, um, yeah, it becomes a lot more decentralized. Then you have to make everything yourself, and then you have to find a way to pay for all this stuff. And yeah, it basically devolves more or less.
This structure of militaries lasted from the early medieval period to the late 15th and 16th centuries, when the more powerful Western European states developed the bureaucratic and financial apparatus necessary to raise and maintain larger professional standing forces.
Yeah, and it did take to the 15th, 16th century to redo this, because then it wasn't more about the kings; it was more about the states being able to afford such armies at this time, and being able to organize them to be more under the king's command, under a royal army, rather than under a local lord. It took a very long time for us to get back to that system, more or less.
Thus, the typical medieval army at this time would usually number in the low thousands or even hundreds. This is in stark contrast to the massive forces from antiquity, where an estimated 100,000 soldiers participated in the famed Battle of Cannae, as opposed to the medieval Battle of Agincourt, which featured, at most, half that number.
True, and we don't even know Agincourt. Agincourt could literally be 10,000 people, 10,000 soldiers at best, at maximum, and we just don't know. But the small medieval armies are actually a thing because you can't supply these massive forces like you used to because your state is no longer as big. Also, another thing is that these guys are. He'll get into it probably, but the freemen are also farmers, whereas the Roman legionaries were nothing but soldiers. These guys were part-time soldiers at best. We'll get into the men at arms thing and mercenaries because they're more professional soldiers. But yeah,
However, a more detailed discussion of this phenomenon will have to wait for another time. As for the composition of this typical medieval army, you would expect a core force made up of the armed household and retinue of the social elite. These generally had the best gear and might be either on foot or on horseback.
okay, so let's break this down a little bit. So when he says aristocrat, he's talking noble. Okay, you go all the way up from emperor all the way down to knight. Okay, is generally what you consider an aristocrat. Okay, just that general range is an aristocrat. Now, knights are trained so since birth to be basically born killers, and they can kill everyone more or less if they're pretty good at it, which they should be if they're training for 21 years. Now, an aristocratic retinue. Okay, what that is not a noble per se, but a freeman. So I can use England as the best example. So let's say you're a knight, you have to have 10 people around you. Okay, 10 people you have to bring to your lord for military service. Okay, these 10 people are considered your retinue. What is your retinue? Basically everyone that you trust enough to be in a retinue that is combat experienced enough. Okay, so these can be men at arms. So for example, a yeoman archer or yeoman longbowman. Okay, he's like a free archer. He's above a serf and above a peasant. Okay, and he is very good at his job. Okay, but he's not an aristocrat. A very important distinction. He's not an aristocrat, but he has better gear, and is more trained than a regular peasant, and that would be considered his retinue. When you bring that retinue together, then you start getting these assemblies of armies.
Bolstering their ranks would be non-aristocratic freemen who could be called up for service when the need arose.
And these are basically just the people under the lord, under his fief. He's like, "Hey, peasants, come here," and they pick up whatever they have, either whatever they have or whatever the lord would provide them. Okay, most of these guys wouldn't really be purchasing their equipment unless they knew they would be doing this a lot. That's more an aristocratic retinue. Okay, the aristocrat retinue would basically be purchasing their own gear because they know they're going to be doing this a lot. Okay, these freemen are just farmers that are going to be doing this part time and they really don't want to do it. Okay, retinues are guys that want to do it, and the aristocrats obviously have money.
Their gear would vary greatly, but was usually expected to at least meet some basic standards, which were often tied to legal obligations for the maintenance of arms, based on their socio-economic status.
And since there's an example, this would be England. Okay, so England introduced the longbow, right? They had to have every Sunday they had to train. Okay, so a basic requirement for all these freemen depends on their status, right? If they're freemen, actually freemen, which very many were not, they would have to have a certain level of gear. Okay, it's just like they had to have a longbow, 20 archer, 20 quills, a sword of some kind, some body armor, and a helmet. And you could throw that together pretty easily. And then they had to be raised up and called up to go. And then that's how they would be provided their equipment, or their lord could provide them equipment, depending on how nice your lord is.
And lastly would come the auxiliary forces, such as foreign allies or hired mercenaries, whose quality again would vary, but was probably at least high enough to warrant their inclusion in the army.
True, and I would consider I don't know about the foreign allies, it depends on what they are, but mercenaries are definitely better than freemen. They'd be considered somewhere near the aristocratic retinue. Again, depending on how far you want to trust these guys, it depends on their pedigree, right? If they're known for, swapping sides, probably don't want them. But if you know you're going to pay them, it's a pretty good deal. Because they're going to be able to fight a lot better than the freemen, but they are going to cost you a pretty penny. But again, they're basically your professional soldiers. They do it all the time.
Notably missing from this description are the hordes of unwashed peasants with pitchforks you usually see depicted in pop culture. This
Yeah, that very rarely happened. Um, you don't just get. I mean, what's the point, right? You get a peasant. He's a farmer, so he dies. You can't farm the land now. It's a bad idea. Again, you want to provide them with something, right? You can't just have thousands of peasants you're going to throw into a battlefield like some TV shows think you do. Freemen or even peasants. Even these peasants would have like a spear and a shield, and they'd all fight together, right? And they'd be able to do something.
is because such peasants were of little military value and would have imposed a heavy logistical burden. Better to leave them in the fields where they could be productive. Some peasants, however, did fight, either because their socio-economic status meant they were already subject to the levy obligations we previously mentioned, or because they rallied for local defense as a militia that had been armed by the community or by a rich individual.
Yeah, so let me break this thing down a little bit. So peasants or serfs are guys that are farmers that are tied to the land. Okay, 80% of the population is like this. Freedmen, if you go by the definition that the English used, were technically people that own land that were not in a city, that that were free. Okay, so they could freely move around, but their population was tiny, like 10% maybe at best. There were not a lot of them. That's why Magna Carta basically only applied to people in the cities and freedmen. If you actually look at Magna Carta, it says freedmen. Freedmen are a very small percentage of the population. Peasants are the vast majority, and of course, freedmen end up right. So lords and local lords and all of them is applied to. But yeah, uh, basically peasants. If you have pick somebody up from the battle from just around the area and he has no battle experience, he's not going to do very well. But again, it depends on the situations you're going to be in, right? If you can get freedmen that they have land, it's just like the old Roman system where if they have land, they're more inclined, as the system goes, more inclined to defend their own land, and they would be more wealthy, which means they could afford better armor and gear and stuff compared to a peasant.
Again, however, we are speaking in generalities here, and these details would have varied by region and era. With this in context, let's now turn to the process of raising a medieval army. Our discussion will follow this chain of events. 1. Deciding to go to war. 2. The call to arms. 3. Mustering the troops. 4. Deployment for battle. As one might expect, something would always prompt the decision to go to war, whether or not it actually amounted to a valid casus belli. It will therefore be useful for us to spend a little time talking about the nature of medieval warfare and what might trigger a large-scale conflict. Simply put, warfare in the medieval period was quite common. As with the army sizes, however, its scope was rather reduced compared to antiquity. There was a far greater prevalence of low-level combat going on in the form of raiding and skirmishing than, for instance, the massed battles of Hollywood.
Yeah, mass battles in the medieval times. The reason we know about Agincourt and all these big medieval battles is they were so rare that they wrote them down. Sieges happened all the time. Raiding happened all the time. Nobody writes about those down. Sometimes we write about sieges, but basically you're just sitting there for 6 months trying to starve them out rather than assault the castle because you don't want to assault a castle because it's going to cost you so many lives. It's not going to be worth it. And raiding and skirmishing was generally reality. Also, as I mentioned previously, right, your army sizes are only like a couple thousand, maybe, and maybe in the hundreds. Whereas antiquity, they would have like 20,000, legionaries, or they put 5 legions together, stuff like that. And also, fighting was quite common back then, back in medieval times. A lot more than it is today. So as much as people think it is.
For our purposes, however, we will be focused on the larger scale wars, which did indeed occur, but were simply more rare. These conflicts could occur for all sorts of reasons, but often boiled down to the following issues: territorial expansion, often for control of valuable resources such as land, which really is at the root of most conflicts; political feuds, often involving claims to the throne, like the 100 Years' War; holy wars, like the Crusades; and reconquest, like the Byzantine campaigns of Justinian. So let's say that one of these wars was brewing. How did the decision to pull the trigger come about? Well, we must understand that going to war was no light undertaking. Most rulers viewed large-scale war as a significant risk, both because of the great expense and the danger of defeat. Even attempts at raising armies that did not take the field could be ruinously expensive and crippling politically.
This is very true. So just say, for example, in England, they wanted to raise an army just in case of a war. They had to one send out all the messages. All the lords would then have to gather up in a specific point. Okay, so they had to take all of their guys, and then they had to call up some levies, right? Some peasants or freemen, and they can't work, so they can't sell their crops, right? Because they're gone, and the women would have to take over, which is not talked about, but the women would have to take over and do this job. But again, the actual experienced farmers are all gone, and then the harvest can be missed. And since a husband and wife would be farming, and the wife is the only one that can do it, you get half the yield. And then that cripples the economy, and then politically, you're like, why the fuck are we sitting here? There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to go into why you don't want to raise an army that's absolutely necessary.
Therefore, the lead-up to war might take years or even decades to develop. Much of this time would have been spent marshalling the necessary resources and political capital for the undertaking. Despite the common view of kings as all-powerful dictatorial figures, they existed in an era of decentralized power and often lacked the personal resources and authority to take on the war effort alone. Rulers therefore had to make compromises and deals with other powerful bodies within the realm and beyond to achieve their aims.
So this is talking about, for example, the king most of the time mostly did not have a royal army. Again, they had some personal bodyguards, like a retinue that would be around them, but it's not enough to win a war against another country or not different kingdom. We're not talking about countries yet. So they have to talk with their dukes, and they have to get their dukes on board to give them money. And the duke would be like, "I want this piece of land if we're doing this. I want X, Y, and Z." And he has to negotiate, and then he had to go to the counts, and then he had all the way down. And you can see why this could take a while.
This negotiation process involved talks with aristocrats, religious authorities, diplomats, bankers, and consultative or legislative bodies such as the Imperial Diet of the Holy Roman Empire or the Parliament in England.
I don't know if Parliament was around then, but it's more consulting about the local lords. But I get what he's trying to say.
The amount of politicking and negotiation needed to solicit support for a war was often dependent on the type of conflict being fought and the stakeholders involved. Broadly speaking, though, defensive wars were simpler matters. The logistical and financial burdens were relatively light, and the threat to one's own community was a powerful motivator.
Especially for the common soldiers who defend themselves, right? To be like, hey, we're calling you up because we're getting attacked, versus, hey, I'm calling you up and we're going over in France to take their stuff, right? So I'll give an example. The 100 Years' War. A French soldier, I'll just call him a militia guy, is raised up, right? He's like, hey, we got to raise you up. It's going to cost the French king a lot less resources and food and basically logistical power because you're fighting in your own country, right? And you have to hold them off and you basically get a large army together, okay? But the problem is for England, since they're the offensive guys, they have to gather all their guys up. They then have to convince them that, hey, we're going over to France to attack them and take their shit, and because I want the crown. So then you have to ship everyone over on ships, and you have to supply them in enemy territory. It gets very expensive, okay? And it's also a lot harder to convince a guy to go overseas and, fight versus, hey, we're fighting for our land, like in France.
It's the offensive wars in foreign territory that were the real problem. These required much greater logistical and financial preparation, especially if they were conducted overseas. For instance, the debt accumulated by Richard the Lionheart during his many wars was massive, and the ransom for his capture alone is estimated to have cost 2 to 3 times the annual income of the crown.
It's insane. Yeah, I don't think we'll talk about ransoms in this video, but basically, if you capture an aristocrat, oh, the money you can make. That's why they didn't really kill aristocrats, and that's why mercy, my lord, or gallantry or chivalry, right? We call it peasants. Kill them all the time. Doesn't matter. But if you capture a knight, and even better, if you capture a prince, I mean, a prince can end a war. If you capture the heir to the kingdom of whatever, you can end a war at that point. You just win. But yeah, again, you would keep the aristocrats alive because you basically get ransom and get so much money. As you said, 3 times the crown expenses for a year, right? For Richard the Lionheart. So.
These financial hardships revealed the strained relationships between the king and his subjects, and eventually contributed to the formation of the Magna Carta. The 100 Years' War a few centuries later between France and England similarly led to political reforms as a result of the negotiations necessary to maintain the conflict.
And basically, it was you had to give a power king to us and us noblemen before we continue this war that's not going anywhere. And we had to pay you, obviously. Right?
But after months of preparation, let's say the decision has finally been made to go to war. What now? Well, their next step was the call to arms. This basically amounted to telling all relevant parties that it was go time. Generally, an initial notice would be sent to key officials and aristocrats, declaring the leader's intentions and justifying the decision to go to war with the necessary political messaging. These would be delivered by couriers who traveled on foot, on horseback, by boat, or by wing in the case of messenger birds. One must imagine such a process taking at least a week or two to reach its intended recipients. After the initial message, an official summons would be issued to alert the crown's vassals and other important figures as to the specifics of their military obligations. Details would include a date and location for the army to muster. These individuals would in turn send out messages to their own vassals and dependents. The process would repeat until it had reached the local level, usually through a system of public cry, whereby heralds would ride out to make announcements in village squares and marketplaces. This call to arms required significant time, not only to account for travel, but also for provisions to be gathered, equipment to be purchased or refurbished, and contracts to be worked out.
It takes a very long time to go do all that stuff, right? First, you got to send the thing to be like, hey, we're going to war to all of your vassals. Then you have to send another thing that says, hey, we're going to be meeting here. This is your obligation to me, and we're going to be meeting here on this date. Then those guys have to send their messages to their vassals to be like, hey, this is what you have to do for me. And then you can see how this takes a massive amount of time, and it's not fast. It's not like, hey, I want to call Dave, and then we'll be up there in like 10 minutes. No.
For example, when William the Conqueror issued a call to arms in 1072 for the purposes of launching a campaign into Scotland, he gave his men 8 weeks to assemble. When Henry V made his preparations for the famed Agincourt campaign in 1415, his forces were largely raised through contracts of indenture, which were formally issued in late April, with an intended date of arrival within 2 months. Now that the word was out amongst the general public, let's move on to talk about the response to the call to arms. The mustering of the troops would have varied greatly by region and time period. However, we can provide some idea of what this looked like by applying this process to the typical medieval army we mentioned previously. Of these, the quickest and most reliable to muster would be the retinue of the social elite.
Basically, you're just calling up your actual household guard. They're near you, guy. They're near you as an aristocrat, and their job is to be your retinue. So they're pretty easy to call out very fast.
And were already close at hand when the call to arms came in. Such troops were generally well-equipped and trained forces of heavy cavalry, infantry, and archers, and thus constituted an important part of a medieval army.
So that what they're calling there in men at arms, I wouldn't know if they would be I don't know if they would be heavy cavalry. That's usually just reserved for knights, which are aristocrats. But it's not unheard of for you to have heavy cavalry guys, like bannermen or something to be mounted. Mounted is totally different. You can have retinue that are mounted. Um, Even yeoman archers that were actual retinue, most of the time would actually be mounted because obviously they don't want to walk. If they have enough money to have a horse, you get paid more. And that's the thing that's going to go down. But yeah, men at arms, basically guys that can actually afford plate armor or something near plate armor. At least in 1415, it would be more plate armor ish for your heavy infantry guys and anybody that's a man at arms, and then archers can afford good stuff. At least for the aristocratic revenue, they could.
A king's personal retinue might number in the hundreds or even thousands of soldiers, while lesser nobles further down the hierarchy might only be able to call on a handful of men.
And it just depends, right? As he said, like the royal retinue of the king is probably a few hundred guys that are very well equipped, whereas the knight's retinue is probably just a few guys, maybe one or two that have really good equipment. Whereas the kings probably all have plate armor. Let's be honest here; they probably have plate and they have everything they need.
Retinues became increasingly professionalized over the course of the Middle Ages and would often be supplemented in times of war by subcontracting with smaller companies of professional soldiers. In England, these arrangements would be called contracts of indenture and would eventually be issued for the whole army in the late medieval period. The next major group to muster would be the non-aristocratic freemen, who assembled as part of a levy or militia unit. These were quite common institutions, especially in urban population centers.
Yeah, that is true. As I stated before in this video, freedmen, it determines what you actually say, because if you use cities, they are free, and I don't know if they're considered freemen, but they're a different class, right? And then they actually can be malicious. Peasants are out in the field, and they're their own thing, and then freemen are their own actual thing. But I get what he's saying. He's like freemen in the general city area, they would be formed into militias, and they have to, provide their own gear and stuff like that.
Most regions and cities across Europe had some form of obligated military service for freemen, and even required them to possess weaponry suitable for their level of income.
A little more thing we could get into there is it depends on how much your level of income was, and then it also depends on how much you would get paid. So, for example, if you're just a regular longbowman that has like a jacket and a helmet, obviously you want a helmet. You always want a helmet. Just basic helmet, a jacket that'll stop some cutting blows, and a longbow. You're not going to get paid that much. Whereas if you are a longbowman that has plate armor, you have a horse, you have years of experience, you have a good longbow, you have a decent helmet, you're going to get paid more because you just have more gear and you're just more expensive to maintain more or less, and you get paid more for your experience.
However, these obligations were not intended as a general draft for military service in offensive field armies, but rather as a tool for local defense and peacekeeping.
This is true because it's very hard to be like, hey, Freeman, come over here. The guys that went to England in Agincourt, well, going and talking about Agincourt for a little bit, those longbow guys that went over to Agincourt, they were technically, right, I wouldn't call them mercenaries, but they were the ones that volunteered to go over there. They're like, hey, yeah, I'm going to take time off whatever I'm doing, and I'm going to go volunteer to go over there. Whereas the French guys were able to raise their entire army, all their vassals guys, and the local defense forces. So their army was ridiculously larger than the English. And dumb how they lost, but that's basically what happened. All the guys that went over were basically not professional soldiers, I would say, but they wanted to be there. And they had some experience at this point by the time Agincourt happened, because they've been sieging things for a while.
In 14th century France, for example, when the king made his call to arms in the face of an English invasion, towns had to make a payment in money or bodies proportional to their wealth and size. A well-off community, for instance, might have to supply one soldier for each 100 hearths, while a poorer village only supplied one soldier for each 200 hearths. Rulers, such as Edward I of England, sometimes attempted to expand these obligations into a larger form of military service that would provide infantry for field armies, but these groups were typically smaller. Finding troops eligible to serve in them was often difficult, as the most capable soldiers had already found other employment.
Yeah, it's mercenaries, retinues, or whatever, basically. And then you go to the second tier. It's harder to find guys you need.
The last major group to mention in our muster are the auxiliary forces. These might have been made up of hired professional forces, mercenaries, and foreign allies. The line between these groups can be hard to define given the many forms of military service in the medieval period. Generally, though, these types of soldiers might be acquired as part of political treaties and alliances, or might be hired from groups of free companies, as was the case in 14th century Italy. Such forces could be quite efficient in mustering, given the incentives of paid service, but there might be a substantial lag time for negotiation and transport. Throughout the mustering period, one can therefore expect all kinds of activity taking place. Small groups would assemble on the local level and proceed towards the main rally point, gathering into larger groups along the way for the sake of organization, discipline, and mutual protection. Once at the muster point, the commanders of a force would have to present themselves to a royal official to be officially counted and assigned a position in the army. This was an important process, as there was really no way of knowing exactly how many people would show up.
This is true. They didn't have like a census to be like, hey, this is who X, and But more or less, the thing that you probably not gonna talk about is like the aristocrats and knights would all be grouped up together now. They weren't, generally speaking. The French did their own thing with the gerrymandry. Um, they're their own thing with royal knights, and they actually did fight and train together. But these aristocratic retinues would just, not really train together. They would then gather up in an area, and as he said, they would report to an aristocrat, and he'd be assigned to a thing. Basically, all the aristocrats, which are all knights, would all be basically assigned to different cavalry units. But now they've never really trained together. But the whole thing you can get onto. But basically, they would do tournaments, right? But tournaments aren't practicing in the field army. Poland did something else completely different to this, but these guys wouldn't usually train together in a mass formation of cavalry. They would know how to ride and they know how to lance, but they wouldn't train together in a unit, which leads to problems with basically units doing raiding and fucking off and getting the baggage train. But that's just one of those problems that's not really talked about. I don't think you'll talk about it, but it is knights that have to get into a heavy cavalry unit that aren't trained together. And it's also a bigger problem for all of these other soldiers. They're not really training together. They're all basically put into a unit and like, hey, this is what you do.
Once registered at the muster, soldiers would camp along with the larger host and wait for the assembly of forces to finish. Due to the amalgamated nature of medieval armies, rulers attempted to maintain discipline by issuing ordinances that prohibited insults, brawling, and other conflicts that could disrupt the cohesion of the army. This encampment would usually be located near a port or a border territory for easier movement once the army was finally on the march. How the army moved to the area where they would fight was dependent on geography. Land wars were fairly straightforward, and an army would often simply march there.
Another thing you could think about here is I don't honestly, God to believe, don't believe that they would actually train. Again, it depends. They may train, but most of the time they're just kind of waiting around for guys. We have to get way into later periods for them to actually train together, but it wouldn't be unheard of for them to be like, hey, let's all gather up and at least practice our formation so we know what the fuck we're doing. Um, Again, it's going to highly depend, and it depends on what sorts you're going to do. But again, it depends. It depends if they would train or not. But yeah,
Wars overseas were more complicated and required the use of naval transports, as might be the case for an English expedition to the continent or armies going on crusade to the Holy Land. However, medieval states did not maintain large purpose-built navies, and they would have to either impress merchant ships for military purposes or pay significant expenses to hire ships for transporting the army.
this is a very important fact to remember. Is like basically there was no Royal Navy, um, at least as the we think it today. It was way later in like the 16th and 17th century that they would start to actually put together a Royal Navy, and England was one of the very first to do this because they are an island nation. But yeah, basically you'd be like, go to the dockyards, be like, hey, we need to borrow your ship. We'll pay you X to get us over there, and that's just how it was.
The logistic requirements of an army were enormous. not only from the army itself, but also from the large number of support personnel, camp followers, and animals that accompanied medieval armies.
I completely forgot about that. Um, Logistical requirements for when you're talking about camp followers and animals, you have to think of the people. So an army wasn't just the soldiers; it would be their wives. It'd be, how should I put this? Workers, workers of the night, people that would sell them stuff. Merchants would follow these guys. There'd be people that want to clean their armor. There'd be people that are willing to sell them food. There's a whole bunch of people that follow this army, which does slow it down, obviously, and does lead to problems that you can basically put yourself together. But that is a thing.
War horses, pack animals, and livestock brought for food all required enormous quantities of forage themselves. The efforts of medieval commanders to meet this logistical demand by requisitioning supplies and transport under royal authority often proved politically unpopular. When embarking or in friendly territory, medieval armies did their best to remain together and retain a sense of organization. On campaign in enemy territories, medieval armies tended to spread out to scout, forage, and raid. Small units as large as 200 or 300 would break off from the main army to gather supplies and loot villages. These raiding and foraging actions were extremely brutal for local civilians caught in the path of marching armies, even when some rulers attempted to limit the damage that their armies inflicted for political purposes.
And it also again depends. Generally, there are some things in which they burned everything down and they'd kill everyone and they'd rape the women and stuff. But there's also things of them just walking in the town surrenders, the guy looks around, he takes their food, he's like, okay, and he takes like a cross of gold, and that's it, and he leaves them alone. Again, it's highly dependent on what type of raiding they're doing and who it's against. You have the things of we'll just steal your food, maybe like a cross or two for gold, that's it, and leave you alone. Versus, we kill all you and we burn everything down and we take everything. Um, it's a sliding scale.
When the army was approaching its main target or a large enemy force, it would once again reconsolidate and prepare for battle. However, discussions of this stage of medieval warfare will have to wait for another time. We hope you've appreciated this in-depth look at how to raise a medieval army. Stay tuned for more exciting videos on ancient warfare.
And I think that's the end of the video, so I'll cut it off there. But yes, hope you guys enjoyed my reaction. That's one of the most popular, or one of my subjects I learn a lot about is medieval stuff. And hopefully my insight is useful. Otherwise, if you guys want to check out the videos and support me and all that stuff, it's down below. Otherwise, I shall see you people next time.